First of all, thank you all so much for coming. I am, for those who don't know me, I'm Leon Mangasarian. I'm Olvi and Claire's oldest son. And we are here today to remember and celebrate the life of my father, and also to mourn his passing. I won't talk about Dad's professional life. Professor Michael Ferris and Professor Robert Meyer, who can do that much better than I can, will do that a bit later. My father was the hardest working person I've ever known. And when I was a teenager and I was fooling around, which I unfortunately did quite a bit of back in the 1970s, my father would come to me with a standard challenging question: haven't you got something better to do? And actually, I almost fear that at this moment, he might climb off the cloud where he's hopefully sitting now and come right back to this room and ask me the same jarring question. But he would pause and he would look around this room and he would see all of you. And I think he would see all of you, the people who he really loved most. His family, the close relatives he loved the most, and the people he respected most, as scientists, as academics, and as intellectuals. And then I think his always big heart would soften, and he would turn to me and give me a nod to go ahead, but with a very stern admonishment: keep it short. Because Dad always firmly applied Mies van der Rohe's design dictum to public speaking: less is more. Behind almost every successful person there stands a partner. My mom, Claire Mangasarian, was always there for Dad. She is an artist, a wife, and was always my dad's best advisor. She is also the mother of 3 boys, and is to this day really always there for all of us. Thank you so much, Mom. And to keep with the architectural terms, Mom is really the supporting pillar, the keystone of our family. My father was born in 1934 in Baghdad, Iraq, into a family of Armenian refugees. Baghdad in those days had a multi-ethnic population left over from the Ottoman Empire. And Dad grew up on a street that was mainly Armenian, flanked by streets that were mainly Jewish or mainly Greek. He spoke Armenian at home, Arabic on the street and at the family business, and English in the Jesuit school that he attended. He was always full of praise for his Jesuit teachers, who mainly came from the US and Ireland. He said that most of them had PhDs, and they were so learned and so intelligent that they probably could have or should have been teaching at universities. The influence of the Arabic language and culture on my father cannot be underestimated. Throughout his life, when he was adding up figures, I would always hear him whispering in Arabic, whispering the words in Arabic for the numbers. With his mother, Josa, and his oldest brother, Johnny, he often spoke Arabic, and he really knew all of the Baghdadi slang. He knew the Arabic language on the street, and he loved to use this sort of slang and exaggerate it, and it would usually end up with him and his older brother just in peals of laughter. Shortly before his passing, he was being cared for at the Oakwood Village here in Madison, and one of the nurses was from Palestine, and she spoke with him in Arabic, and even though he was not well, his eyes lit up at being able to speak the language of his childhood. The Jesuit influence was also huge. Age 16, my father decided he wanted to become a Catholic priest. I suspect much to the horror of my grandmother. But he swiftly ditched this idea and studied for 2 years at the American University in Beirut before winning a place at Princeton. Now, Princeton was a real eye-opener for my dad. On arrival, he became a member of the Colonial Club, which was founded in 1891 and is one of the oldest and most prestigious eating clubs at Princeton, where students like my dad also lived. He arrived outfitted in suits made by his Uncle Aram in Beirut, who was a tailor. Now, unfortunately, what was high fashion in Beirut in the early 1950s wasn't what a young man wanted to be wearing at an Ivy League university. And Dad was always grateful that one of the senior members of the Colonial Club pulled him aside and discreetly informed him that the Beirut zoot suits, as Dad himself dubbed them, didn't cut it, and accompanied him to Brooks Brothers and told him what to buy. Dad became quite dapper, and a photo from the Colonial Club, which I have here next to me, which is really one of my favorite photos of my father, along with the photo on this program here, shows him grinning proudly in a bow tie. And if you look at this picture here, there are only 4 or 5 of these young men who are wearing bow ties. The rest of them are quite conventional with a normal striped tie, I guess, of the Colonial Club. So Dad really had a big interest in getting dressed up at that time, and actually my earliest memories of Dad are from the 1960s, when he was corporate man working at the Shell Development Company in Emeryville, California. And I remember him so well, leaving the house each morning in black shiny shoes, a suit, a white shirt, and a tie. He had a fantastic collection of neckties, and he had a special love for tweed jackets. More profoundly, my father said he also realized something else on his first day at Princeton. And this meant a great deal to him. Unlike in Baghdad or Beirut, for the first time in his life, he was not part of a minority. As I mentioned, my dad was the hardest working person I've ever met. And each evening, after dinner and without complaint, he would sit at his desk for several hours of academic work before going to bed. Yet, more simple household jobs were also part of his workload. Together with our beloved late Uncle Johnny, an electrical engineer, he rewired the entire house on Old Middleton Road. And the task was accompanied by very loud discussions in Arabic, lots of good-natured cussing, also in Arabic. And for my brothers Aram, Jeff, and myself, the whole process had huge entertainment value. But Dad later said we must never use some of the quite earthy Arabic swear words that we picked up during those days. A few years ago, Dad was proud to show me, with the help of Google Earth, one of his projects from my childhood. Back in 1965, he spent a long weekend pouring concrete to build a new driveway for our house in Berryman Street in Berkeley, California. And thanks to Google Earth, we were able to see that the concrete driveway was not only still there, but it was still in perfect shape. My father was just as delighted about this as he was about any successful academic paper. Now, my dad loved quotes, quips, wisecracks, and his library contains a huge collection of books, such as this one, a well-thumbed edition titled The Ultimate Insult. And I'll just read you just one or two of the things that struck me on media, which maybe I should be a little bit worried about. Fortunately, it's television. Television is the bland leading the bland. Or literature. All writers are vain, selfish, and lazy, and at the very bottom, their motives are a mystery. That's George Orwell. And I think this one Dad would have especially, I'm sure this is the one he probably bought the book for, on sports. Golf is a good walk spoiled. But there was a more serious side to all this, however. Dad often used quotes to teach a lesson or hammer home a message. Here's an example. Back when I was 9 or 10 years old, I convinced Dad to take me ice fishing on Lake Mendota. Now, to be diplomatic about it, outdoor Wisconsin winter sports were not very high on my dad's list of things he liked to do. We, of course, caught nothing. And then driving home, we passed a supermarket. "Look there," Dad said. "You can buy any kind of fish you want. and we just spent hours on Lake Siberia. Turning to me, he then said, Einstein said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting a different result. Well, we have to expand that definition to include ice fishing. Now, I had no idea who Einstein was, but he seemed important, and I never, ever dared ask my father to take me ice fishing again. While we're on the subject of Wisconsin weather, it's no secret that Dad never warmed to Madison winters. For years after our arrival from California in 1967, whenever he'd see a car with California license plates, his heartfelt, instant exclamation was, "Lucky Californians." And that's why Mom and Dad were so delighted to buy a winter home in San Diego some 25 years ago. What did I learn from my father? The list is long. Love of family. In 1969, when I was 9 years old, the son of our neighbor was killed in the Vietnam War at the age of 19. I was confused and terrified by the war, and Dad repeatedly comforted me with the words, "Don't worry, you will never go to Vietnam. If the war continues, we will move to Canada." It's hard to describe today how reassuring those words were to a frightened child. Character. Dad always treated everybody the same, no matter what station in life they came from. So I kind of grew up thinking that was a normal state of affairs. And then I went out into the big bad world and realized, actually, no, that isn't the way things work. So, working as a journalist for 30 years, I at least attempted to practice what Dad taught me. I treated everybody I interviewed exactly the same, regardless of whether they were a president or a prime minister or a coal miner or a cleaning lady. And in fact, to really apply Dad's rule correctly, you would probably treat the coal miner or the cleaning lady slightly better than the prime minister or the president. Generosity. Almost all the emails received after my father's death note his academic generosity and the time he spent discussing, replying, or pondering what colleagues and students told him. But although Dad's generosity to us was emotional and intellectual, it also must be said that it was material too. Dad and Mom always made sure that all three of their sons had enough money to study, and even now in my advanced years, every time I would come home, Dad would slip me some cash, brushing off all my thanks and all my attempts to say it wasn't necessary. But I think this is really one of the most important things about my father that can't be stressed enough. One of my father's finest traits was that he loved to give. Some more learning from my father. Number one, start your morning with the BBC World Service. He did this regularly, and I do it every morning using a small Panasonic radio that he gave me 3 decades ago. Number two, study history, follow politics, and read newspapers. I got my love of all three from my father, and it turned out to become my career in journalism. Dad devoured history books, and I'm doing my best to imitate him. Number three, I learned from my father what a silly German politician who later failed miserably falsely described as secondary virtues. Things like always keep your word. Things like always be punctual, because this is also showing respect to others. And simple things like life is also duty. Today's often alarming political world, I think these virtues are anything but secondary. Number four, on a lighter note, always buy in bulk. Dad was a firm believer that if you're going to buy something, you should buy it in bulk. Paper towels, napkins, his trademark blue button-down shirts, you name it. And I am exactly the same way, and it drives my dear wife to despair. My father, though never a big drinker, also believed in mixing drinks in bulk. Whenever guests were expected, he'd mix a huge batch of martinis and store them in a bottle in the freezer in our basement. Now, in my case, this turned out to be a sly temperance ploy on his part. One weekend when I was 15 or 16, I snuck downstairs and I pulled the bottle out of the freezer. Now, I had no idea what that opaque liquid was in the bottle, but I uncorked it and took a big swig. And choking and gagging, I stuffed the bottle back into the freezer and slammed it shut. And I don't think I ever tried a martini again for the next 30 years. Number 5, far more seriously, a love of classical and especially Baroque music. My father adored Johann Sebastian Bach and all the Bach sons, as well as Vivaldi, Albinoni, and Corelli, just to name a few. I listen almost daily to the CDs that my father gave me, and I think the greatest cultural gift that I think my father gave to all of us was an appreciation of classical music. When I attended a performance of Bach's Christmas oratorio in Leipzig's St. Thomas Church, where Bach served as concertmaster, and he's also buried, I almost felt the spirit of my father hovering over my shoulder. These are just a few of my memories of my father, Professor Olvi Mangasarian, and we hope that you will share some of your memories with us after this commemoration service. In keeping with my dad's love of classical music, my entire family is delighted that Ben Ferris agreed to accompany this celebration of my father with the music of Bach. Thank you so much, Ben. It's really wonderful that you agreed to come and play for us today. And Ben will now play Johann Sebastian Bach's unaccompanied cello suite number 2. now there will be tributes from Professor Michael Ferris, Professor Robert Meyer, and Richard Cottle, which will be read by my brother, Olvi Mangasarian.
I'm wearing the blue shirt here. Requisite. My colleague Jerry Zhu remarked that when he met Olvi, the first thing that Olvi blurted out was, "I do support vector machines," with sparkling eyes full of excitement. You know, those wonderful blue eyes, those steely blue eyes that he had. This was not unusual. Olvi was so full of ideas. Every time you went into his office, either as a student, a postdoc, a researcher, or a colleague, he would bombard you with a host of new approaches, things to consider, ways you should attack your problem. He and I worked together on parallel optimization, on complementarity problems, on theory and practice. We wrote a book together with Steve Wright on linear programming, and his touch is present throughout the text in choice of material and method of presentation. Olvi Mangasarian, the John von Neumann Emeritus Professor of Computer Sciences, was the epitome of a professor in the classical sense. A scholar, a leader, a world expert in his discipline, a mentor to colleagues, a teacher of many, innovative and focused. Olvi was also gracious with his time, patient with his explanations, quick to praise others, efficient and reliable. When recruiting for new faculty in our group, I state that we have no prima donnas and that everyone has a voice and an ability to spread a vision. This is a key legacy from Olvi to the optimization group at Wisconsin. Olvi was a colleague, a mentor, and a friend. He and Claire welcomed my family into their home, even including my parents when they visited. Without doubt, he is the person who influenced my career more than anyone else. I would not be here right now had he not guided me through the process of being a researcher, an educator, a professor. Peter Glynn from Stanford comments that Olvi set a great example as a senior colleague. And I have tried in the years, he says, since to model my own behavior on the example he set. Jude Shavlik states, Olvi was the most valuable UW faculty member in terms of my career, while Steve Robinson, Guri Sohi, Renato De Leone and Stefano Lucidi, among others across the globe, mention his influence and mentorship in their careers. He shaped not only the foundations of our field, but also the many who have profited from his guidance and his example. Olvi was my PhD examiner at Cambridge. The exam was on the 4th of July, but Olvi didn't mention that this was really a holiday. We obviously don't celebrate that event in England. He just travelled to the UK to adjudicate. He came to my defence over a minus sign that was critical for my approach, but not to the liking of the other examiner. Oh, the details that we academics fret over. A minus sign. I was able to return the favour since he struggled with the bath. We had to go to Woolworths to get a rubber hose to connect to the hot and cold water taps into some makeshift shower so that he could do his hair. But he never stopped smiling throughout that whole trip. Olvi was a great teacher. Jim Burke at Washington told me that Olvi's optimization courses were the most inspiring courses he had the privilege to take. Danny Ralph from Cambridge recalls Olvi as a barrel of enthusiasm, injecting warmth and depth into everything. He remembers being entranced and paralyzed, he says, unfortunately in that order, by theorems of the alternative, and mentioned how Olvi led unexpected discussions on subjects like how to fit a circular table into a polyhedral boardroom. He was as much a wizard as a professor in coming up with solutions to these kinds of problems. He taught mathematical rigor and had an infectious optimism in life as well as in research. Jinyi Kachai recalls NP hardness would not diminish his enthusiasm for finding a practical solution one bit. As a young collaborator, the single most important thing he did me was to force me to think on my feet, whittle away the key driving mechanism from the myriad of examples that were coming out, or the underlying issue. I would like at least to try to find a key driving principle or common theme from the 200 or so published papers in several books that is his legacy. A tall order, but something that may have even piqued his interest. My view is that trade-offs permeated his work. Not the trade-offs between good or poor results. His work was always carefully executed and precise. But how optimizers or decision makers can take into account or value a trade-off between one facet of the problem and another. In nonlinear programming, the trade-off was between objectives and constraints based on the study of prices or multipliers. The Mangasarian-Fromovitz constraint qualification, which bears his name, is still cited as the best condition to guarantee that such trade-offs are possible. In his work on algorithms, smoothing, for example, was used to trade off accuracy against speed or efficiency. In the data mining work, trade-offs arose as a balancing between reducing error on known samples and generalization to predictions for new samples. The process of feature selection, for example. In application problems, the trade-off between harming good cells and killing off bad cells was also something that he worked to actually encompass and incorporate into his models. Grace Waba comments on their collaboration. I had many interesting and warm-hearted discussions with Olvi about the time he was doing his impressive breast cancer classification work. Olvi complained to me that statisticians didn't understand his work. It turned out that his method was essentially a support vector machine before support vector machines became popular and bridges a divide between computer scientists and statisticians. So Olvi's work on classification was really prescient. While all of these thoughts I've given you are not an exhaustive summary, I hope they give you a feel for his work and the man behind it. Olvi accrued many accolades in his career and were always self-effacing about them. However, I would be remiss if I didn't at least say Princeton graduate, PhD in applied mathematics from Harvard, Lanchester Prize, Hildal Award, Siam Fellow. I really wanted to name my wharf chair in his honor, but he was uncomfortable about that. Olvi had many excellent students. Lots of them provided me with comments of his knowledge, cheer, kind-heartedness, patience, generosity, and his infectious enthusiasm. In his honor, American Family Insurance has donated a collection of new GPU machines callable as Olvi 1, Olvi 2, for example. They're to be part of the American Family Insurance Data Science Institute here at Wisconsin. This would not have happened without impetus provided by one of his students, Glenn Fung. To close, one collaborator signed his email of recollections about this great scholar, dedicated teacher and mentor, dear colleague, and above all, kind, warm, gentle, beloved human being, with the byline, Zhongxi Pang, Olvi's student forever. We will all remain students of Olvi forever.
Let me start by thanking Claire for the opportunity to participate in this celebration of Olvi's life. His life is truly worth celebrating. I'd like to use some words by Shakespeare to indicate my feelings about Olvi. These are from Mark Antony's famous oration at another memorial. Here was a Caesar, when comes such another? In our academic family, Olvi stood out like a Caesar, and another like him will not be coming in our lifetimes. On a personal level, I count myself remarkably fortunate in having had Olvi as a true friend for more than 50 years. During all those years, Olvi never spoke an unkind word to me. This is really quite extraordinary, but Olvi was an extraordinary person. Olvi supported me through some very difficult times. I would not be standing here today if that had not been the case. Although Olvi asked very little in return, I would like to cite one favor that he asked of me. While he deeply appreciated the talents of his PhD students, some of whom are here today, he absolutely hated sitting through those famously lengthy UW graduation ceremonies. So as he approached retirement, he would ask me on occasion to serve as a graduation escort for his PhD students. I have to say that I disliked those graduation ceremonies too, but they provided a rare opportunity for me to do something for Olvi. So I donned my graduation robes and I braced myself for the prospect of watching students march across the stage for several hours. After we both retired, I thought I would never again have to attend another graduation. That was going to be one of the great retirement perks. Unfortunately, I was wrong. It turned out that my sister was finally able to move ahead academically in spite of the fact that she worked full-time, and she managed to get an associate degree at a small community college in Pennsylvania. Well, the ceremony there, I steeled myself and attended it, was somewhat less onerous than the Wisconsin ceremonies. And the reason for that is that students had interesting things written on the tops of their caps. On top of one cap, I saw the student had inscribed, "Already forgot everything." Well, I can assure everyone here that in spite of my participation in innumerable graduations, I will never forget Olvi. His perennial kindness and joie de vivre are truly unforgettable and provided me with memories I'll always treasure. I'll close by just thanking Claire for giving me another opportunity to show my great appreciation of Olvi and to celebrate his very wonderful life that he willingly shared with family, friends, and colleagues, thereby making us all so much the richer.
For those of you who don't know me or don't recognize me because you haven't seen me in about 20 years, I'm happy to be able to read a short remembering of Olvi from one of his colleagues, Richard Cottle, who's a professor over at Stanford. He says, some assembled here today may recall the special volume of the journal Computational Optimization and Applications, guest edited by Zhongxi Pang, and dedicated to Olvi on the occasion of his 65th birthday. Included in this festschrift of 24 papers is one of mine called Quartic Barriers. The paper opens with 2 paragraphs of personal remarks from which I plan to borrow. Olvi's scholarly career is impressive and well recognized, and it's characterized by his fundamental contributions over a wide range of topics, energetically carried out for many decades. My memories of Olvi go back to the early 1960s, when Olvi was employed as a mathematician at the Shell Development Company in Emeryville, California. I was a doctoral student in mathematics at Berkeley, and I met Olvi at colloquia either at Stanford or Berkeley. And at the time, Olvi and I shared an interest in methods for solving bimatrix games by quadratic programming. Well, that sounds like a lot of fun. If I'm not mistaken, I wrote a little piece for Mathematical Reviews on one of Olvi's publications. What I am sure of is that Olvi's research work inspired my own for many years. His book, Nonlinear Programming, published in 1969, was a valuable addition to the literature of mathematical programming, and I used it extensively in my research and teaching at Stanford. I remember that when any of my students would ask me about alternative theorems for linear inequality systems, I would direct them to Olvi's book and say, I think you'll find what you need on page 34. Many of these students believe that I had memorized the entire book, right down to the page number of its contents. In the late 1970s, Olvi developed an interest in solving certain kinds of linear complementarity problems, or LCPs, by linear programming. His ideas on this subject appeared in several papers, and it was my good fortune to have an insight on the first of these papers by Olvi and to discuss it with Zhongxi Pang, then a doctoral student of mine. This gave rise to a set of papers interleaved with papers by Olvi on least element solutions of LCPs. Later, I was strongly influenced by Olvi's work on iterative and parallel computing methods for LCPs, and I remember referring to a versatile algorithm of Olvi's as the Swiss Army knife of iterative methods for large-scale LCPs. Now this, I'm going to pause for a moment because Olvi would have particularly appreciated the description of something he created as the Swiss Army knife, because many of you know he loved Swiss Army knives, and he always carried one in his pocket. So he was armed for intellectual battle or whatever came his way, along with the blue Uniball pen and the mechanical pencil right here in his pocket. Over the years, Olvi and I, as well as our wives, Claire and Sue respectively, enjoyed a cordial friendship. Olvi spent a sabbatical leave at the Stanford Operations Research Department. Sue and I fondly remember that we invited Olvi and Claire to a New Year's Eve party held at our house. During that period, the party was a tradition featuring the playing of chamber music by many of the guests, one of whom was Olvi and Claire's son, Aram, who performed ably on the cello. Well, I don't remember performing ably, but I think I managed to get through without too many mistakes. The four of us would sometimes get together at professional conferences, such as the International Symposium on Mathematical Programming. One of these, the meeting in Tokyo, stands out in my mind. At home, prior to the meeting, I injured my foot in such a way that it required stitches, which were supposed to be removed after a certain number of days. As it happened, that number of days was in Tokyo. I was fortunate to have the stitches removed in our hotel room by Professor Olvi Mangasarian, accompanied by Claire, and this is one of Olvi's many deeds for which I am grateful. I think you all know what he used to remove those stitches. I feel blessed to have received so much of Olvi's kindness, generosity, and lasting friendship. Richard W. Connell. So thanks. That's from Richard, and it's lovely to be able to share that with all of you today here in the golf club.
Thank you all so much for those very kind words. Now, Ben Ferris is going to play Johann Sebastian Bach's unaccompanied cello suite number 1.